Welcome, fellow plebs. My name is Sean, and this is
Tribunus Plebis.
All right, guys. Welcome back. Thank you for stopping by again. The first thing that we're going to touch on in this episode is the protests and specifically the police response. And flat out, the police response here has been absolutely atrocious. This is not even debatable at any serious level. If we stop and think about why these protests began, and not even the hyper-specific reason, which is the lynching of George Floyd by 4 police officers, but if we focus on the broader issue, that of poverty, racist policing, police abuse, violence, and even murder, and then we look at what is going on in these cities and streets, it becomes pretty clear, I think. The police are the problem. And I'm sorry, but I know that's hard to hear for a lot of people here in America, but I think it's absolutely true. People watch a police officer just straight out murder a man in the street in broad daylight while he knows he is being filmed. And then they watch that officer walk free for 4 days. So they protest. They protest against the lynching of a black man. They protest racist policing. They protest police abuse. They protest against police brutality itself. And how do the police deal with these protests? With more abuse, with more brutality. Savage, violent, unchecked brutality. And no, fuck that. I will not couch these terms. Police forces are behaving like fucking stormtroopers all across this country. They show up to peaceful protests, armored up and wielding shield and club. They have rubber bullet guns, smoke and tear gas launchers, and plenty of pepper spray. This alone, this showing up dressed in tactical gear and armor and armed to the tits, that is escalation right off the bat. The cops are showing up actively looking for a fight. And if the protesters do not bite and provide the police with the excuse that they need to assault them, then the cops are just flat out attacking them for no reason. The cops aren't even generating a plausible excuse. They just start tossing flashbangs and tear gas and attack. Then they have the gall to blame the people whom they just physically assaulted and beat for making them do it. And yes, do not get this twisted, the police are far and away the primary escalators of violence at these protests. You can literally watch hours of peaceful protests, and you can see the police just get bored and start lobbing flashbang grenades into the crowd, launching tear gas and smoke canisters, and firing pepper balls indiscriminately into the unarmed crowd of peaceful protesters. Then they move in and begin the beatings. Right now, I kind of wish I had a YouTube show, just so I could play like a 12-hour-long compilation of cops assaulting, beating, abusing, and torturing hundreds and thousands of people, innocent of all but the fact that they are protesting police violence. And over those 12 hours, not a single second would be a repeat. Yes, the police are beating, mauling, and injuring protesters who are protesting police violence. And no, again, let us not be deluded. The victims of these assaults, they are not criminals. They are exercising their right to protest. They are exercising their First Amendment right to free speech. And, as an aside here, I just want to ask something. Where the fuck are the so-called free speech warriors who lose their minds over not being able to say racial epithets on Twitter and YouTube? I just scanned a bunch of their Twitter and YouTube feeds. Unsurprisingly, they have either nothing or very little to say about the actual government actually preventing actual free speech. And not free speech like in that broad, overstretched Twitter version, but actual free speech, First Amendment free speech, the amendment that says that the government cannot force you to not speak. The silence from this particular group of dubiously intentioned goobers is pretty telling as to what they were actually quote-unquote fighting for. I'm sorry, but those goofballs really annoy me. So, back to what we were talking about. Anyone out there who is confused about this concept, let me clarify it for you. YouTube saying that you cannot say a racial epithet is not an attack on your First Amendment rights. It just isn't. On the other side, police shooting you in the face with a 2-inch long hard rubber bullet to shut you the fuck up is a clear and fucking obvious breach of the First Amendment. Like I said, I obviously can't show you the videos in a podcast, but I'm going to just throw out a few not even highlights, a few lowlights here. A woman is on her knees covering her face as she is dealing with the effects of either tear gas or pepper spray, and a cop strolls casually up to her and front kicks her in the chest. A very small woman approaches a large group of police It looks like she says something to them, and then one of the officers, a steroid-fueled asshole from the looks of him, steps out of formation and shoves her to the ground so hard that she hits her head and begins having seizures. I'd also note that in this video, a commanding officer is walking behind the thug cop and witnesses the attack but does absolutely nothing. There are thousands of these videos. I don't even know how many to mention or, what to mention, but I will end with one of the more disturbing assaults. It's the one from Buffalo, New York. The video by now is very viral. In the video, an old man, and I mean old man, he's thin, frail, and he doesn't even walk all that well. I think they said he was 78 years old. And I mention his frailty because I really want you to understand just how vulnerable this man was. He approaches a pack of fully geared up riot cops, full armor, helmets, and weapons. And it's a large group. It's not one cop by himself. It's a large group of riot cops. It's just unbelievable to see. And this old man, he dodders over to the approaching gang of thugs, and he tries to say something to them. Two of these so-called cops, two of them, keep in mind, they shove this old man and he falls straight over backwards and slams his head into the concrete. And the sound of his head hitting that sidewalk is just disgusting and disturbing, and it's hard to describe. It's hard to even watch, listen to. It's terrible. Immediately, blood begins to pool under his head and run out of his ear. The violent prick thugs who attacked this man just step over his body, as do others. Then one cop, he has a moment, a very brief moment of compassion and humanity, and he starts to bend over to check on the old man who is unconscious and bleeding. And you know what happens? The cop behind him, he pushes that other cop forward, and he doesn't let him help that man. That is a disgusting level of violence that these pieces of shit have fallen to. Once again, no, I will not moderate this language. This is straight up gang shit. Fuck that. I do not care if this hurts your heart to hear, or if you don't like me saying it. Shit, I don't want to say this. I really don't. But let me clue you in on something. I am not tarnishing the police here. The police are tarnishing themselves through their actions. In another video, a woman asks a cop what happens at 8 o'clock when the curfew kicks in. The cop replies, "What happens is we start beating the shit out of you." That is the actual quote. What happens is we start beating the shit out of you. A cop said that to a woman. That come 8 o'clock when the curfew kicks in, then he and the rest of his buddies will start beating the shit out of people. This is tyranny. And I normally don't throw this other term around in my blog or on here, but I'm going to use it right now. This is fascistic bullshit. In New York, Governor Cuomo said that they have to, quote, separate the protesters from the looting, end quote. No, we don't. In fact, I'd argue that it is impossible to do so in good faith. This separation that Cuomo is suggesting is little more than a clever rhetorical trick to shift focus and divide those on the side of the protesters. Cuomo and others are trying to say that those who steal sneakers from a store are not legitimate protesters, that the destruction of a police car or even a police station is not a political act or a protest with a clear intentions and messages. Again, this is a lie, and it is 100% intended to divide us. Cuomo also made the claim that, quote, they demean Mr. Floyd's murder by using it as an excuse for criminal activity, end quote. No, Governor Cuomo, it is you who demeans the death of Mr. Floyd by attempting to delegitimize an entire movement with your words. You are trying to break a movement because it is focused on the violence of police forces and the authorities who allow it to happen. In short, you are trying to delegitimize this movement because it threatens your position. And now, you remember how I mentioned that woman who asked the cop what happens after curfew, and the cop said, what happens is we start beating the shit out of you? Well, Cuomo instituted a curfew, and guess what happens every night as a curfew kicks in? We watch the cops turn into wild, violent animals as a curfew kicks in and they begin to beat their fellow man. Just to make sure we understand something here, curfews and police beatings, both of which are meant to stop us from speaking, are attacks on our First Amendment rights. Remember that. All of these police actions are little more than collective, indiscriminate punishment delivered to the masses of people who are protesting, wait for the irony, police brutality. Police apply pressure to a situation, and if and when the citizens respond, the police use that response as an excuse to commit acts of violence and oppression. And then they pop up and they get behind a podium, and they talk about how they arrested 200 quote-unquote rioters, and then they hit them with the charges. If they are being particularly gross, they may even roll out a couple of photos of officers with some cuts and abrasions that they acquired as they tackled fleeing, innocent protesters to the ground to engender sympathy. They use these arrests and supposed injuries to claim and be granted even greater power and the freedom to use that power. And with police, more power always means more aggressive attacks and bigger weapons. And we as citizens, we just accept this. And the policing becomes even more focused and even more cruel. And as the police find that every new precedence of violence is met with shrugs and apologies from the citizenry, they continue to push the acceptable limits. Encounters with police become ever more violent, contentious, and deadly. So, I have seen a lot of people saying things like, "Let the police off their leashes, let them go." And we get arguments about sheepdogs and wolves and whatever, and they say, "Just let them do their job, stop holding them back, Mayor whoever." Hell no. The worst possible thing to do is to let police off their leashes. The police are the violent fists of the state. Never, ever let police off their leashes. Ever. Under any circumstances. This might be one of the most disgusting and ignorant responses to these protests that we see. Never, ever give police the freedom to perpetrate violence and violate our rights. Ever. And to further bolster this argument that the police are the primary culprits when it comes to escalating these protests into violence and mayhem, we saw the police in Oakland completely ignore a protest in that city. And guess what happened? Rioting? Looting? Perhaps some just generalized mayhem? Nope, just a bunch of peaceful protesters protesting. And everybody just sort of, went home after some chanting, protesting, and even some dancing. The very last of the stragglers walked away sometime around 2 a.m. The police did not interfere. They made 0 arrests, and there was no property damage, no looting, and no violence. Every one of these protesters broke the curfew, and they all walked away and went home because even the Oakland police chief recognizes that these people were merely exercising their First Amendment rights. This should tell us something about where the violence is actually starting, and it should also tell us where the baseline response by police should be. Basically, it should be hands off. And now we have the President of the United States talking about deploying active duty federal troops into U.S. cities. Now let me say that another way. The sitting president wants to turn the United States into occupied territory. The very idea that any person of any level of power in this country is actually considering letting the military loose against civilians should send shudders of fear and rage through the body and soul of anyone who hears it. If you support this action and you also consider yourself a patriot, you are a delusional moron. The ramifications of deploying federal troops into our cities, especially unbidden and unilaterally, are difficult if not impossible to understate. The results of such a move are irrelevant. You think they wouldn't do anything wrong? That they'd perform better than cops? That the protests would end? Maybe, but at what cost? Seriously, do you think that this would be the end of troops in our streets? Every time a president does something like this, they set a precedent. And every time a precedent is set, the justification for extreme actions like deploying active duty troops into the United States itself as an opposition force becomes easier and easier to make. Republican shitbag Senator Tom Cotton said this. He said, quote, "Let's see how these anarchists respond when the 101st Airborne is on the other side of the street," end quote. Let's see how the unarmed citizens who are protesting police violence and exercising their guaranteed right to speak freely respond to an active duty light infantry force, which has been sent to deny them that speech. It's an interesting question, but I think Senator Cotton has the question entirely backwards. If such a horrific command were ever actually given and followed, what I'd like to see is what the 101st Airborne does when confronted with citizens protesting across the street from them. And if the answer is anything more violent than simply standing at attention and watching the protest, then those soldiers and our military are fucking traitors. As a side note here, anybody who can't suss out why the difference in Senator Cotton's framing of this question and my own is so important probably should not be a senator. And honestly, if Army infantry are deployed to a city around me, I'd be there standing with the protesters. And I'm not saying I would even want to be there, or that I'm brave, or that I'd want to fight against a trained military unit, but I am saying that a domestic military occupation is exactly the precise type of thing we should pour into the streets to oppose. I wouldn't be there because the prospect of facing off with soldiers would be fun, exhilarating, or ideal. I'd be there because it would be my duty as a human being and as a citizen. This is where we should rage and scream and fight if need be, because such a thing as deploying troops into U.S. cities absolutely, positively cannot be allowed to stand. Okay, I want to shift gears here a little bit and talk about the people who are talking about the protests. Yes, the media. Both the traditional media and the new media like YouTube, Twitter, and yes, even the humble podcaster. At its core, the media narrative, especially the mainstream legacy and conservative media narratives, they are sensationalized garbage. And it is not sensationalized only for ratings. When we see the media reporting on the protests, we need to ask ourselves why footage of a looted Target or a burning building is given so much more time and gnashing of teeth and rending of hair and moralizing than dead bodies. Why do these television assholes spend so much time flagellating the so-called rioters in this meaningless way? Why is the media talk so focused on destruction of property and not on the destruction of human lives? Before we answer those questions, let me be very, very clear about something that a lot of people seem to want to ignore. Human lives are more important than property. And hey, maybe it is just me, but property crime is not a greater crime than murder, or even the systemic oppression from state-sanctioned terrorism. Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, somebody stole a lamp. Oh my God. Let's report this endlessly and ignore the Gestapo tactics of the police who uphold the very same status quo that we do. Oh my God, if they didn't steal that lamp, we definitely would talk about that other thing. But oh my God, they stole that lamp. Listen, the theft of throw pillows from a Target store should be the last thing reported on here. Every broadcast, YouTube show, and tweet should be focusing on the fact that George Floyd was murdered by cops. And we should talk about racist police, racist policing, racist police tactics, and the sick internal culture that leads police to so callously degrade entire communities and to murder a man on film. Too often, the murder of Mr. Floyd is mentioned only briefly and only as a jumping off point to talk about what the news seems to think is the real problem, the theft of some decorative soaps from a department store. I mean, hey, I guess we all know by this point in our lives that the theft of some sandalwood soap formed into the shape of a beautiful starfish is the most important thing. Oh, no, wait a minute. That's right, I almost forgot that important thing I wanted to remember. Human lives are more important than property. But wait, we support the good protesters, they yell from their brightly lit television sets, but those looters ruin it. No, they really don't. They don't ruin a goddamn thing, and these media people know this. You want to know who ruins things in these situations? It's the media. The media which creates this false narrative that only the protester who is active between the very respectable hours of 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. can have a legitimate grievance. Or only the protesters in polo shirts, creased slacks, and sensible loafers are worthy of being listened to. They think that those gross, looters should not be listened to. There is no way that they have a legitimate grievance. They just want to steal stuff. There is no way that they could actually be angry at a system which is literally killing them, and they are tired of being ignored by both the powers that be and the media itself. No, of course that can't be right. Of course the media wouldn't peddle self-serving lies, and if you don't believe them, just ask the media yourself. Listen, the media is rolling out these false narratives to delegitimize protest. All protest. To destabilize the entire movement, and we swallow, digest, and repeat it uncritically. Colin Kaepernick took a knee to protest police brutality. The media spun this into a story about black men protesting the flag, the anthem, and soldiers. They took a quiet, peaceful protest against black men being murdered by police and turned it into a protest against, well, America itself, I guess. And the public bought it, and they still buy it. They repeat it to this very day. The media and the cultural cesspool in which it thrives, the cesspool of hate, division, and vitriol, which it both sustains and feeds off of in a sick, twisted symbiosis of their own supposed authority and our own societal gullibility, have removed all legitimate protest from those who seek change. In fact, these same forces have removed all forms of protest that they would have accepted as legitimate before they were actually used. All that is left is populist street protests. To quote liberal Uber hero John F. Kennedy, quote, "Those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable." End quote. The establishment now reaps what it sows, and it hates the fucking taste. Good. It should. So should we all. Stop falling for this obvious bullshit. We see actual video of police attacking entirely peaceful protests. We see it with our own eyes. We watch police escalate violence, brutalize peaceful protesters, ram human beings with their cars, assault, punch, kick, and shoot people who are no threat. Then we watch the media feed us a steady diet of headlines like, "Protest turned violent," or 100 arrested at violent protest. Anything to ignore the actual problem and frame the police as neutral parties who have been forced to quote-unquote do their jobs. And we can see the video, folks. You can go Google them right now. We can read the stories. We can hear the screams for mercy. We can hear the tear gas launchers and the clubs slamming into flesh. We can hear the police screaming to go get them and fuck them up. And after all that, we buy this Antifa stuff? Really? You're really going to buy that? You are going to let these politicians and talking heads gaslight you that hard? Seriously? We are really going to believe this bullshit. It's time to pull our heads out of our asses and actually look around and see and understand what's going on, not just to passively consume the popular narrative. We need to stand up for ourselves, cast aside the political divides that the elites attempt to force us to choose between, and act like free-thinking fucking human beings.